Hello, this is Michelle Verdonk again, talking about technology, specifically talking about assistive technology, an area of expertise that is very close to my heart, and I'm really excited to be sharing some of this content with you. I'd also like to credit LifeTech, who have contributed to several of the slides here over the years, and thank you for all the work that they do in this field. So one of the learning objectives for OCC311 is to understand the various ways in which we define assistive technology. And in order to do this, we probably need to look at a variety of different models. So we already talked in some of the previous presentations about how we describe assistive technology as being high or low, or as being soft or hard. But now we're going to talk about the actual models and the interaction of assistive technology. So the most common referenced assistive technology model is the HAAT model. Myself, clinically in practice, I haven't seen anyone apply it. I've only seen it discussed in research context, and it is one that is endorsed by the Assistive Technology Association of North America. So they're North Americans because they publish a little more than the rest of the world sometimes, seem to have published this model. This is a diagram that actually comes out of your textbook, and effectively it's not unlike the PEO because it looks at, instead of the person, environment, and occupation, it looks at the person, the human, the activity they're trying to do, and the assistive technology they're using within the context of the environment. So there's assistive technologies thrown in kind of like as an extra layer. And then in terms of the assistive technology, we look at that in a little more detail. So this is a model that we sometimes use to look at assistive technology. Now the interesting thing about this model is this is a model not necessarily meant for occupational therapists. It's meant for anyone working in the area of assistive technology. So that might be an engineer or a psychologist or a teacher. So for us, it makes sense to consider the human, the activity, the way the technology is working with them. But for others, this model is quite unique because it makes people break up the aspects to consider when considering the assistive technology. Most importantly, that the assistive technology as a device is not the only important thing, which we've mentioned before. Quite often, OTs still just use the PEO as their model for assistive technology, and there's nothing wrong with that. LifeTech might have also suggested that other models like the COA are also relevant. So your OT models are not incorrect as assistive technology models, but we do need to acknowledge that there are some specific AT or assistive technology models out there. One that is very well referenced as well and is used quite a lot in the literature, and that makes a lot of sense just in reading, is the matching person and the technology model. And the matching person and technology model is the work of Marsha Shearer, who's one of the editors of the Disability and Rehab Assistive Technology journal. Looks at the milieu, the personality, and the technology. So you can see this comes from a psychologist. There's a slight different angle to it because we're actually looking at the person's personality as well. Right, so here's a diagram of this matching person and technology model. Now, it's a little overwhelming at the start, but the most important thing is the match of the person and the AT. So it's not actually just taking a device and making it work. It's actually getting the two together. And to do that, you have to consider the person, their mood, their needs, their lifestyles, and that's really client-centered practice, which makes sense to us. We then need to consider the environment they work in, the cultural environment, the legislative, the economic. Again, makes a lot of sense to us as OTs. It's that PE, the E of the PEO. Then the technology itself, because the technology is quite complicated, and I think this is where we start seeing it as a technology-specific model. We have to think about things like the cost of it, the availability of it, the appearance, is it good looking, is it aesthetically pleasing, is it comfortable to use, and does it do what it's meant to do? What's the performance like? And then at the end, you have to look at actually how you select something, how you use it, how you adjust to it or accommodate, as this model says, and then how you evaluate that use. So it's a really thorough model, and it's really nice because it forces people to consider, or forces you as a clinician or an assistive technology practitioner to consider all these multiple aspects, not just how does eye gaze work, for argument's sake. This comes out of the Assistive Technology Assessment Handbook, which is a chapter that I was a co-author in. And it's based on a model actually developed at LifeTech here in Brisbane or in Queensland. And it really looks at the journey, and you will be familiar with this having read the textbook chapter that looks at the assistive technology as kind of a journey where people have to first imagine what they want to do. So they have to establish their goals and expectations, which sounds a lot like the NDIS, doesn't it? Then they need to seek what they want to use, so find out what their requirements are, what their supports are, what kind of device they might need. Then they need to choose, and in the choosing you have a trial element, so trying out something, seeing if it actually works, looking at how you get it funded, and then eventually the purchasing. And you then have to live with the device, which actually means setting it up, fitting it, accessing training, maintaining it, monitoring it. And that last section is vitally important. It's very easy for people to just find devices, but to actually keep them ongoing. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment in the assistive technology field, and probably ongoing discussion, around maintenance of equipment. So how an NDIS plan, for argument's sake, actually includes the maintenance of equipment that may or may not have been purchased within the NDIS. And it's really important for us as OTs to not consider assistive technology as a once-off. It's actually an ongoing thing that requires maintenance and review, and sometimes devices won't work, and we'll get to some of those concepts through these slides. This model here looks a lot like the one we've just seen on the page before. This is actually the NDIS's explanation of how we use assistive technology, which is divided into an initiation, assessment, solution, selection, which is pretty much almost all of the model before, even though it looks similar. And then there's the authorization, the acquiring, the sourcing, and then actually implementing, delivering, training, and then following up and review. So the really encouraging thing here is that the NDIS, with their model or their adapted model that you see on this page here, is acknowledging how assistive technology is not just a one-step process and it's ongoing. It really needs to be considered. So I think this is really encouraging, and I encourage you guys, when you're working in practice, to look at the NDIS's resources around assistive technology. The assistive technology community has worked really, really hard to make sure that the NDIS is well informed about assistive technology and its practices. This particular model is a pediatric one. So that's why I've entitled here OCC311, because it's really the model that is explained in your prescribed reading for OCC301, enabling occupation in the pediatrics and adolescents. And this framework is the SET framework, which looks at the student, the environment, the task, and the tools. Again, looking a little bit like some of the models we've seen before. So what does the student need to do? What's the environment they're working in? What are the tasks they need to do? And what are the tools, which really is about the technology itself. So that's the model that educationists use when considering technology, as we do as occupational therapists. Now, the NDI also looks at technology in terms of level of assistive technology risks. Now, this model is actually quite exciting because it's an Australian-specific model or Australian-specific conceptualization. It's come from Assistive Technology Association of Australia, ARATA, and it's developed over many, many years, because how do we actually conceptualize the different types of technology? You have high and low. Instead of looking at high and low, we actually look at the risks in terms of technology. So at the bottom of the pyramid are level 1 devices that have no risk in them. And as we move up, the devices become more. So if we look at this here, you have level 1, everyday, non-complex everyday devices. Level 2, which are standard AT that require some configuration and maybe require an OT or someone with a little bit of insight to adjust them. So there might be communication boards, a walking frame, or an over toilet seat. Level 3, we're going into the high techs of specialized assistive technology, which actually, funnily enough, would include things like hoists, because you do need to know how to use a hoist correctly. It's not just a small configuration; you need some skills in terms of hoisting. Things like some augmentative or alternative communication boards. And level 4 is the complex and complicated. So the high-end electronic devices, maybe really complicated seating configurations and things like that. So this idea of considering different levels of technology in terms of their complexity, as well as including their risk. So as something becomes more complex, it often has an associated risk. So if you get a level 1 device wrong, there's no major risk involved. So if you give someone the wrong fork, they might not be able to eat. If you give someone the wrong type of powered wheelchair, they might end up falling out of the chair and having some serious damage or possibly even death. Here's the level 1, 2, 3, 4 explained in a tabular form, originally put together in 1996, adapted in 2013, and effectively a lot of it's the work of Natasha Layton, who is the current president of the Assistive Technology Association, ARATA, of Australia. Again, here's a repetition of the same diagram with a bit more explanation from the book chapter that I mentioned earlier that I was a co-author in, which explains the different types of technology, examples, and the complexity and the risk. Right, so we talked about the complexity and risk in terms of classifying different types of technology, different kind of models. Now I want you to step back for a second and consider what it's like to be a technology user, someone who uses assistive technology every single day. You'll have some insight from this during the tutorial when you meet Deb or meet Deb virtually. But using technology is not simple as just using that device. And I'm going to refer to some of the literature here to help you understand some of these concepts and understand the complexity of this. And this is really, really important as OTs. We are expected to understand AT, but we're not expected to understand just how a device fits together or how it works. We're expected to understand its impact on life and occupation in general. Yep, when you thought about using technology, one of the first things that probably came to your mind was not everyone uses it. So in the literature, we talk about abandonment and abandonment of assistive technology. Now, I hate the word abandonment, which is why I tend to use non-use, because actually abandoning assumes that someone's done something wrong. It's got a real negative connotation. Whereas non-use is a choice. I choose not to use something. In terms of trying to avoid abandonment and non-use of technology, which is a lot of a waste of money, it's frustrating, it's just a waste of time. The things we can do. So trials of equipment are really important, and I've referred to some of the literature here. Education on how to use them can improve use. Follow-up is essential. So following up with someone why they're not using it, it might just be something needs to be tweaked. For some people, there's a combating learned helplessness versus self-determination, because having been disabled possibly for a long period of time and having not had access to really good technology might mean that they're used to asking for help all the time, whereas a device might allow them to work or be independent in some other way. But because someone has become used to that, there's an element of learned helplessness, whereas actually realizing by using technology you might actually be able to do something yourself. And as an OT, we sometimes have to broker that process, especially for people who've been disabled for a long time or who have got used to being in a sick role. When you consider cultural factors, the classic example I always use is if you go into some indigenous communities in Australia, you will find everyone but the person who owns a wheelchair using a wheelchair, because the wheelchair belongs to the community. It's just something that culture accepts. So, which is really tricky for you as an OT, because if you're supplying a wheelchair to in a community where someone needs it and everyone thinks it's their device and they get to use it and it gets abused or it gets broken, that's really tricky to deal with. And with a westernized view, we might think that that's really bad use, but it's something we have to acknowledge in terms of culture. Most important, and everyone can relate to this one, is the device worth using? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Can you actually afford it? Is it reliable? Is it portable? Can you get it where you need? A lot of the times, just using technologies, and you know this yourself, you don't use a phone if it's too heavy. You don't use a computer program if you can't work out how to get through it. You don't use something if it keeps breaking. All of these things hold to all technologies, and for assistive technology, it's exactly the same. So we always need to think, is the person who's using it considering it worth using in the first place? What are the benefits of using technology? And this is analysis of 55 letters of people talking about why they use technology. Because it saves money, it's better use of resources, it assists with safeguarding the vulnerable, and it also helps assess care needs. For carers, reduces stress and anxiety or worrying about worrying. It makes informal care relationships more sustainable, because sometimes if someone has to do something for someone the whole time, that relationship becomes about being a carer. Whereas if someone has technology, sometimes they can do a little more for themselves, which means they've got more time to have a relationship with the person who's their carer, or not necessarily the carer, the person acting as their carer. And also it gives time to the carer, increases the carer's independence. This is unpublished research from LifeTech, which maps people's domains of well-being. So it looks at their spiritual well-being, environmental, psychological, social, and physical. And you'll notice that the black lines, the solid black lines, were how someone mapped their domains of well-being before the technology. However, after they gained their technology, there's slight improvements. Psychological, there's not much change. The person is pretty stable. But environmentally, they've got more access. Spiritually, maybe a little more enlightened, a little more quality of well-being. But really noticeable is how much more social this person was after having been given assistive technology. In this case, I believe that this was a powered wheelchair. So someone was a normal wheelchair user, was now getting a powered wheelchair, and by being able to access more in the environment, that really changed their social domain and well-being. And I think mapping things like this really gives you an idea of technology is not just about improving someone's access or making something more environmental. There's lots more to it. This is a nice little diagram from one of the papers that I published in 2014, and the reason I share it here is because occupational therapists I've met out in the community and specifically at assistive technology events all talk highly of this particular model because it makes sense. When people, it pertains to using environmental controls, which is specific time assistive technology, but actually the concept holds to all technology. And again, if you're just a mobile phone user, you'll be able to relate to this. When you start to use a device, it's a real hassle. You have to change your habits because you used to do something a different way. Now using a piece of technology involves changing habits and not getting it right. There's a bit of a frustration with that. So there's a real awkwardness in using technology. But once you use that technology, you sort of overcome it. You start engaging with the device or engaging with the technology, which results sometimes in a good feeling where it's actually kind of fun to use technology. There's sometimes even humor in use of technology and surprise. And so I really wanted to share this because it just shows the complexity. We talk about assistive devices in terms of helping you turn on a TV or helping you to push a wheelchair, get into an environment, but actually it's a lot more complex than that. It's really, really complicated, but really important when someone's learning to use a device that they have to overcome the hassle to be engaged. And as they engage with something, they then encounter more hassle because as you use something more, you discover it's a little bit trickier and it's more frustrating. You have to change some more habits, but then you might have some good feeling, and it goes round in a bit of a circle. So I think this model is quite intuitive, really, for most people who have encountered technology, which should include all of us. Now, I've included this model as well because this is actually the results of a paper that you'll recognize the name Carter there. That's Roger Carter, the librarian. Some of you will know him. A paper myself and Jackie from Canada and Roger, the librarian, published. And what we did is we analyzed all the papers we could find on the use of wheeled mobility devices, wheelchairs, scooters, powered chairs. And we tried to find out what the similarity or what the themes were. And actually we found out that using a device wasn't very specific. It actually was quite complicated. So the use of the device, the experience, actually depended on the social cultural experiences. It depended on the physical environment interaction, and it depended on what we could do with those devices. So having a device made people be able to do more things, but in doing more things they might encounter some obstructions. There were social cultural experiences. Sometimes there was stigma attached. So if using a device gave you stigma, or else using a device made you feel better. So the reason I show you this model is actually because it's not just a unilateral using of a wheelchair is good or bad, or it's positive or it's negative. It actually oscillates, and that the way the experience changes how someone relates themselves to their wheelchair or their scooter. So if they're having a good experience, they can participate in a lot of environments. The society says that they're great. They have a very positive relationship. But for most people, they might be participating in some of their activities, but still encounter some social, cultural stresses or stigma, or they might find the environment is actually enabling. So it's really important to consider that there's so many aspects that go together with the technology. So when you see someone in clinical practice and they tell you that their wheelchair is great, bear in mind that it's probably not great all the time. Some of the time they'll be experiencing stigma, or some of the time they might have environmental barriers. So it's not just is it good or is it bad. You really need to understand the complexity of the situation for every user. Okay, this last section is about identifying possible funding sources of assistive technology. And this section is a little bit tricky to talk about because of the current economy with the NDIS. It's really tricky to work out exactly where the funding is available because a lot of the previous funding sources for assistive technology no longer exist or no longer accessible if you're an NDIS participant. So it was kind of hard to map out these slides, but I didn't want to leave this out of the lecture. Arata have done their best to map out all the options, and I encourage you to have a look at this website. These are all the places you can get technology. So sometimes it might be private, it might be insurance based, and it might be NDIS based, or it might be through charity. So as I mentioned before, NDIS, Department of Veteran Affairs, private insurance, compensation, charity, private funding. There were some other organizations before, KT, VOS, and mass, and it's really I'm really unclear myself at these stages as to how many of those agencies still exist and how many of them we can still access funding for. Most of those agencies only exist most of the agencies that are not NDIS related only exist for someone who can't receive the NDIS. So it's really a little unclear at the moment. Really important to acknowledge our suppliers and probably spend a bit of time looking at suppliers. And in our workshop, we will also be looking at how we access information and how we seek information about assistive technology. Thanks so much for listening.